Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to a new year of IHR seminars, our monthly seminar, which at the moment we're running online. Here in the UK, it's lunchtime, 1300 hours, but we're going out to an international audience online. And here for our first seminar of the year, really delighted to be able to welcome a very distinguished and very old colleague, Professor Daniel Tröhler of the University of Vienna. Daniel was kind enough to be editor of the 4th volume of the Bloomsbury Cultural History of Education, which is an excellent volume indeed. And today he's leading a very interesting talk on exploring what frames our research, the ordinariness of the nation in educational epistemology. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you, Gary. First of all, thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to work with you. We have been knowing each other since many years and appreciating each other's work. So it's an honor and a pleasure. Corona forces us to do that online, but without Corona, I might not even be in London. So we have advantages and disadvantages. Just to be sure what I'm going to talk about, Gary told me just to say what I'm doing right now. So it's a little bit selfish and self-centered, but that's what I'm going to do. It's not kind of, it's telling you what can be done in research, but what I am doing right now. I think that was the invitation, and that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to cope with nationalism, but not nationalism, the one that the visible one, the hooligan one, but the one that frames our minds and our research and our institutions. So that is what basically is. It's about 35 minutes. That's what we agree. So it's about history of education. And I start with a provocation, which is sometimes good. Maybe it's a risky business, but let's say we are losers. Those who do history in education, they're losers. I have 2 reasons for that. First of all, is that education, as it is set up and it is organized and vision, it's towards the future. We want to do a better world than it is today because we're sure it's a bad place. We want to do it better, and usually we do that by educating children. So it's much about salvation. It's about amends of perceived sins and wrongs. And the other reason why we are kind of losers, but I will come back to that anyhow, is that today in education research, there are particular methods that are being dominant that are not usually applied by historians of education, but it is what they call empirical research on the state of the art of an educational situation that is designed to make a better future. So education as a practice, also as a research organization, is future-oriented and it's empirical, whereas history of education deals with the past, obviously, maybe at best a history of the present, but not to the future. And it is not empirical in the sense in which empiricists use the term today. That's why I say, okay, we're a loser, we're out there, who cares about us, except of us, of course. So history seems to be somewhat luxury, maybe even a useless luxury. And what we can offer to the others may be entertaining, and that's nice. If they do volumes, collected volumes, we always get the first chapter. So that, history is done, so we can go to the real important things. That's the way it is organized. So, but not too quick. What I like to mention too is that the state of the art, or the state of society that we usually think in education is full of sin, full of problems that needs to be solved. Well, it is a historical product. The society 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it was different. So it has evolved. It's always a result of historical movements. But that's only the one aspect. The other one is that it is different in different places. Social life, society in England is not the same as in Romania or in Tanzania. So we have a diversity, a cultural and historical diversity. We should be better aware of that. But then again, the second point, the vision of the future, they're not always all over the place the same. So visions about how society should be organized, what a good society is, what a good citizen is, what justice is very different in different places. So that is culturally diverse. Now, also the idea what the child is that is supposed to learn to become a better member for a better society, that's very different. The child as seen in progressive education, for instance, in the United States by pragmatism, is completely a different one that the child as perceived by behaviorism, also in the United States. So how do we know what the appropriate picture or idea of the child is? It was different in the 18th century, in the 19th century. It's different all over the world. So it's all historical and it's all cultural. And the same, that's a fourth point, applies to the ways we do research. Of course, people in the 18th century thought that they would have to do research for a better society. But the means by doing research is very different. Look at us. We were once the winners in history of education. In the 19th century, teacher education was moral education, mostly via the history of education. We had the big heroes. And so that were the pictures, that were the ideals, the models for the ongoing teachers. Today, we're down to somewhere that's not very important. But we can say it has changed, it's historical and it's cultural. So that is one thing that we can say. So what we can actually say to education in the field of education as historians is that we may be a little bit more than only entertaining or a luxury. We can be, in fact, disturbing and irritating, and that's good. We can say, well, you know, what you think about how to solve that problem, we've tried that before, it didn't work. And you should maybe know a little better how the state of the art of education and society is always a historical product, that we look through our historicized or historically grown epistemologies. So we can add, actually, we can add something to the discussions if we say it in a very good way. Now, this belongs to research, it belongs to the state of the art, it belongs to the child, and it belongs to the future. We are, and I don't say this as an attorney of history of education, I'm a historian of education, we are radically historical and we are cultural. So that's something to keep in mind, I guess. Now, I'll give you an example, man. Since I was invited to talk about my research, this is a little bit narcissistic, but I hope you forgive me for that. So we've been doing a lot of research about, as a cultural move, or a cultural interpretation about OECD PISA. So we can say, if we reconstruct that historically, not morally, we can say we have a style of research that is motivated by a kind of policy, evidence-based policy it's called. So they give a lot of money to the psychologists. But we say they have three motives. We have a social epistemology of Presbyterianism. You can see that very well how in Teachers College in the United States, led by the Presbyterians as antithesis to the pragmatists, developing a particular kind of behaviorism and the way how to govern by data already around 1900 with Thorndike, for instance. And you see a trajectory to the Cold War, that's then the second part, and the National Defense Education Act, and how the Americans were influencing the OECD in order to create these indicators in the 90s and PISA after 2000, and how they do actually work as researchers. Why they follow the epistemology of biomedicine. That's evidence-based, that is from biomedicine. So if we do that, and of course this is very short, if you want to read it, please feel free, but don't do it if you're not interested in it. So in other words, and here we can become funny and provocative. You can recognize in those PISA people, if you sum it up in Cold Warrior concerned Presbyterians, who like to do lab-like research in white coats. promise a better world, which of course will not come. So that's the part where, if you're historically informed, can enter a discussion and be a little bit disturbing. And I think that's one of our jobs that we have to do. So the amusing irony behind that, by the way, is that those people working in these large-scale assessments have no clue about their own historicity, about their own role, what made them possible, the way that they act and the ways that, how they start to dominate the education research field. That is maybe the tragic thing, but it's funny for us to see that as historians. So, first conclusion, at least we have some irony, and I think intellectual fun. Now we could then say, okay, we're not only losers, but we are mocking losers, happy losers, or lucky losers. But it's a problem a little bit with historians of education. We're not really humorous people. Most people in education, they're severe. They don't have a lot of humor, I think. At least I cannot say that for the majority of the people after being 40 years engaged in research. So we do not excel in what I love Shaftesbury, what he said, it's a freedom of wit and humor. As a demand of intellectuals. We don't have that, we don't share that. We're too much concerned about the bad and the strive for the good. We are severe, we have no irony. We have actually, I don't think people have a lot of fun when they are doing research. So in the end, what I feel, that doesn't apply to Gary, to anyone here, of course, but all the other ones, so most of the other ones. After we write just boring stuff, if you look at those journals like international journals, I'm not going to name any of the history of education. You know, you see a lot of chapters or articles in there that are not really interested. The question is a little bit why? Why is it kind of boring? Now, the one reason is, and that's the major point I'm heading to now today, is usually these articles are being written about things, events, occasions, persons, institutions that occurred or happened in their own country of the authors at some point. And usually they are published in a journal or in a book volume that is edited in a company that is in the same country, from the same country, and the publishers come again from the same country. So what we face here often is nationally closed communities of researching and publishing. And that is, to me, one of the problems, because you start to talk only to those people who you know and where you can be assured that they share the same intellectual, I would say, national, cultural background. Now, obviously, it has some advantages. A close community is fine. It's comfort zone. You have little disturbance. Of course, what we see is a lot of reproduction of the same styles of argument, the same research question, on and on. That's why it's getting boring. Now, you can, of course, if you adapt to these rules, often unwritten rules, an academic career, you can become a lecturer, even a professor, if you move up the ladder, and you don't really disturb people too much. But at the same time, in doing so, I don't think we really explore the real potentials in doing historical research. I'm not challenging that people do something about their own country. That's not the point. My point is that when and I come to these two dots in the lower part of the slide, that we often start these stories, our stories that we tell in the publications, they start from unspoken or unarticulated circumstances, taken for granted assumptions that are not discussed. And I call that the context of our research object. We isolate a research object without declaring why this research object is interesting from the point of view where it appears on stage, or why I put a focus on it. And normally the second point is we don't actually reflect our research interest. If we feel something is important, a priest somewhere doing a school somewhere, we think everyone should be interested in it. That's usually not the case, at least maybe Gary is much nicer and thinks most of the articles printed in history, published in history of education are interesting. I don't. So I'm talking here about the disease of decontextualization. And I think most of the publications that I read or start to read and end sooner or later is, I don't understand what they're dealing with, why they're doing this. So that applies to a large degree to historiography today, not only to historiography, but we're talking about the history of education. I'd like to take, I hope you permit me that I took an example of England. We can say, okay, 1870 education. As far as I know, it introduced free compulsory education in England and was for the first time in England on a national scale. Now, why is it interesting? Is it interesting? Yes, but why? What is it a case of? Of what? What is the large story of the 1817 Education Act? Or we could take the 1902 Education Act, which was defined or discussed with more heated voices in a contested part of the history of your country. And then we can say, okay, we have this Education Act. It's the first. We need to understand why. Then you can go to the National Education League because they were founded a year before. Say, well, these men were good, and we came to this Education Act. Or you can go to the political side of it, 1867 Reform Act that had enfranchised part of the urban male working classes in England and Wales, and people were saying, well, if they are allowed to have democratic power, we kind of need to discipline them. They need to be educated. We don't want them to be anarchists or socialists. So we do schooling in order to have a good electorate. Now, these stories have been told, as you know, but I don't think that's enough. I think this is still not the whole story I would like to, I would like to argue today. It's not that I wish to challenge projects like this if, under the condition, they widen the focus and make this case, the Education Act of 1870 or 1902, of something larger. But now the question is, what is the larger context? Why is it a case of something much bigger? Now, the bigger thing could be, and I guess that's one of the good ways, to make comparisons. Now, as you may know, or might know, or probably even should know, England is a latecomer with regard to Education Acts, probably one of the last in the Western world. Now, if you extend it only to the UK, then you include Scotland. And if you look at Scotland, you have a very different story, because it has erected a thorough national school system a quarter of 1,000 years before you, 250 years in the 17th century. Now, the idea, the reaction usually is that, well, Scotland is different because it was governed by Presbyterians, a weak queen. As early in the 16th century, it got nationalized by the equally minded parliaments. And then we are back with the Presbyterians, like in Pisa. And that's my point, not the Presbyterians, but that we come to thought systems, to discourses, to styles of reasoning, if you like, that govern the mind of people and frame the action. And that's what I'm going to talk about, but I have already used a third of the time or a little bit more. My plan for today, after this longer introduction, is these 4 points. I'm going to talk about frames of thinking that are invisible and by that very effective. Not only thinking, but also about institutionalizing education and research. Second point, we're going to talk in that context about talking about what enables us to speak. And we'll indicate to how nationalism is not something to deal with, at least not in this context, about a moral problem, but as a discourse that frames our minds and our institutions. And we'll bring in the end a few examples. I will stick to the time, I hope, more or less. Otherwise, I'm going to speed up a little bit. So first point. Now we can go back Scotland say, well, yes, it is different. It's religiously different, it's nationally different. And even the 300 years of union hasn't changed it. If you have any doubts, talk to Nicola Sturgeon. She will tell you how Scotland is different. She's a politician, she needs to say that in this party. Now, talking about cultures, cultures as an encompassing system that we share in making sense of the world, we are addressing an issue that intellectuals today do not like too much to talk about it for various reasons. The two most important ones are religion and nationalism. These two are framing the way we think, and we don't like that actually. Why? We do, because we do, and that's the fourth volume of the Bloomsbury book, that series that Gary was editing. We think we are heirs of the Enlightenment. We are rational, not national. We are scientific, not religious, so we are secular. But I think in most part, that's an illusion. We are, in the way we perceive the world and in which we formulate theories and strategies, we are saturated with religious and national elements. And they are even more effective than they should be because we don't want to recognize them. We are governed by that, but we don't talk about what governs our thinking. And that brings me actually to my purpose of this talk here. It's about making aware those cultural powers or linguistic powers or discursive powers that govern our minds, not only as citizens, but also as researchers, how it frames what makes us then define a good research object, research questions, research methods, that are usually formulated and decided upon within the context that we are thinking, without reflecting the context that makes us think the way we think. Now, I have been talking about two elements, two major powers. One is religion, one is the nation. In the last 20 years, I've done a lot about religious influences, especially about Protestantism. You can see here a summary if you want to get that. But today I'm going to talk about nationalism because that's the thing I'm working right now for the last 3 years and for the next, whatever, 5 years maybe. And that's then the end. Then I will be retired, so that's fine. So that's going to be my focus today. But just to give you a little idea how religion shapes educational reasoning, both in policy and research, just look at the architecture of the school systems, how they are erected. Let's just look at one little single piece of it, the transition regimes from elementary to secondary level. Now you can see very easily conservative Catholic countries, they make this transition at the age of 10. So either you're going into an academic, intellectual class at the age of 11, or you go one that brings you into vocational training. That is in Italy and in Austria. So you got a very clear church hierarchy is kind of already being organized at the age of 10. Now we go to Lutheran countries in Scandinavia or Northern Germany, they have compulsory education until the age of 16, no selection in between. And then we have Calvinist countries like the US and moderate Calvinist countries like England. They do have a comprehensive school as the Lutheran ones, but in parallel, they have fee-based private education for the privileged families. And if you look at the politicians, where they have been going to school and later on to universities, you see what it means to have these private tracks that bring you up the social ladder. That's an influence of, and I'm not going to go into detail to tell you how, but you see how this architecture and selection processes leading to stratification, social stratification, do have to do something with religious ideals. But I'm not going to talk about religion today, as I told you, but I'm going to talk about the way epistemological traditions are shaped by national characteristics, maybe, or preferences. Now, the example I take here is, I assume that being in England or related to England, you know what utilitarianism is, or you've heard at least Bentham or John Stuart Mill, Goodwin or Sidgwick. Now, what do we see on that list? They're all English. So utilitarianism is a very specific way of understanding and doing science. In England, it's natural. In the 19th century, you were this as a rule. And it was a way to think and to conducting research that deliberately set itself apart from Germany, which with its idealistic tradition of doing research. So it is maybe funny to know for you, if you're not aware of it, in Germany, if you do research and you call them utilitarian, you're out. That is kind of, you're stupid, you're an idiot. The same if you do in Germany, if you're called a pragmatist or a positivist, you're out. You're not a good researcher. And actually, we can go back to these traditions and see, well, utilitarianism is English. German had to have idealism. Pragmatism is something very American, and positivism is very French. So we have systems of reasoning and doing research that is kind of nationally connoted. You see all strong nation states in the 19th century, and that shaped the way we conduct research. Now, my point is not to say which one is best. So since you're English, you probably utilitarianism. No, it's not the point. The point is that we have nationally framed ways of doing research, and I call that epistemologies, so that make us feel about that is an important object, that is an important methodology, that is an important research questions. And that's nationally framed. It shows up imperial, global, but it's national. And that is interesting to me. So these national minds or national cultures shape both our institutions and our research traditions. They are not just applied, they act in a way that we don't even notice. We notice maybe if we compare, but if we don't compare, we don't notice them. They do set the standards which we learn and take them for granted, at least those who have been entered and socialized into a particular system in a school, in the university, and in the academy. Now, when I was telling you in the beginning that most of the studies are boring for me, I was precisely referring to those articles that start from within and never get out. So they reproduce in a way the same epistemology. And I think this is not interesting and not bringing us anywhere. We don't need to reproduce, we need to find new ways to think about things. And that's the second point, talking about what enables us to speak. So if we go to this field of what allows us to speak in a way and to ignore others, we are in what I call, or what is called the linguistic term. And I think here England has had a very good tradition in linguistic analysis. If we go to John Austin and Quentin Skinner, but then of course, since I'm in Vienna, I need also to name Ludwig Wittgenstein, who has Viennese roots. The idea is just from Austin's book, maybe in the 62, but it was he died a little bit before, how to do things with words. So it refers to an idea that language does not only depict the reality, but it creates reality. And that's why we need to look at what creates our perception of reality. That's the idea that is behind it. I work with the so-called Cambridge School. Both are not in Cambridge anymore, Pocock and Skinner. Pocock refers to a Swiss linguist, the Saussure, with the distinction between langue and parole. And I give here an example, but I guess you will get the PowerPoint since I'm running a little bit out of time. I need to speed up. But the idea is parole, the words that you hear, that you read, has always an ideological content, and the ideological content comes from something called langue, and today it's all mostly called discourses. That kind of frame the way a notion or a concept is framed and understood. Two wonderful inaugural lectures, Isaiah Berlin, 58 in Oxford, and 4 years later, Quentin Skinner about liberties, the different meanings of liberties and different interpretations, what is more valuable. So they were on both sides of the spectrum talking about the same issue, but from a different point of view. I've been working a lot with Skinner And I think this book regarding method is very illuminating for what I've been talking about. And I tried to actually write a book about that. Well, I didn't try, I wrote a book about this here again, connected to religion as a particular way to speak and which frames the way we think. So what I'm aiming at here is that we need to be aware of what makes us think that particular research objects are interesting, important, why we have this question, and what the really good methodologies and methods is. So we must discover first what makes us curious, what makes us think that this is important, and that is where we should actually leave the comfort zone and try to reconstruct the way in which we become interested. That makes us readable for the rest of the world, and that makes us giving us sense in what we do. Now, the important thing here is nationalism. I think that is one of the frames that has effects on us that is more powerful than most of the others, maybe except maybe of religion. Now we have a problem here, and especially in the English-speaking world, countries usually are called nations, or states are usually called nations. You see that in the United Nations organization. That is a misnomer. Nations are not organized in the UN. It's states. It is states that are organized, because the Sami are not in there, the Kurds are in there, and if we like the Scots again, but they are not in there. But we have Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is certainly not a nation, but a state. So actually it should be called United States organizations, but the Americans didn't want to have this in 44. That is why we call it states, but it's nation. What then is a nation? A nation is something that is a cultural thesis about who we are. We share something. You're not a good English person if you don't behave like this. You're not a Swiss where you're always late. Be on time, or you have to like cheese and chocolate. No, that's a joke. But in a way, nation is kind of an unwritten but powerful rule to tell you how you are. And if you're different, you're an outsider or a migrant or whatever you are. So nationalism is the political way of imposing the idea of the nation to the people. The state, of course, it's a system of power distribution. And the power of both the nation state is, by the way, only possible since the French Revolution, is a win-win situation, because the dominant vision about who we are is being reinforced by national holidays, by national teams in football, in Olympics, and by the school, and vice versa. A state profits from people who identify themselves because they are loyal. And that's why this is a wonderful combination. Nation state, despite the talk of globalization, is important and powerful. So where we have a lot of research, not really relevant in education, but we have Michael Billig, a social psychologist, with his panel Nationalism or Oscribly, Theories of National, Craig Calhoun in Nationalism Matter. They try to think about how people are exposed to ideas of the nation and how they become particular kinds of people that identified with the nation, that are kind of daily exposed to them via national symbols, the flag, for instance, or the school, or whatever is national, or the army. And so I come to the last 4 slides: panel, nationalism, education, and the art of framing national minds. So nationalism has indeed been a topic in research, but has always been a topic of research as an irritating thing, you know, like the hooligans, like those waving the flag and beating up people. That's not what I'm talking about, because if you treat it like this, it's a moral problem, and then you end up with intercultural education or tolerance education. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about our task to move away from this attractive but ugly aesthetics of violent nationalism, and rather ask how it is possible that ordinary people all of a sudden, mostly in times of perceived danger, become aggressive nationalists. Now, the idea, that's the argument of Michael Billig, is that we have built up in our lives, and I argue through schooling, not least through schooling, a reservoir of national identity that can be radicalized if we feel in danger. Now, Billig has called this, and I like that, banal nationalism. You don't even notice it, but look at the flags that you see, the Union Jack, whatever. And others talks about everyday nationalism. So we need to understand how ideas of the nation or cultural value system kind of shape the constitutions of the states. Now, I know in England, you don't have a real constitution, but you have the common law. How this affects schooling, how this affects curricula, how this affects teaching materials. They're all designed kind of to make the desired loyal national citizen. And that's what I call the context of education studies or curriculum studies. Schooling is designed to produce loyal citizens in the respective nation states. So what we came up to with the idea is that schools are designing not just literacies as PISA things, but usually national citizens. If you look at, for instance, how the Americans developed language education, they always said, we teach our Americans not English because that's royal. We need a republic, so it's an American spelling book, not an English spelling book. So it's nationalized because you want at the end to have the kids coming out of school as a particular kind of person, a national person. Now, this nationality is not usually exposed or expressed verbally, it's hidden. That is a kind of a hidden curriculum. And once you see it, you realize it's not that hidden anymore. So it's not about geography or mathematics or history. It's about making people know what they are, and they are what they have to be or should become. Now, there is no magic formula like in statistics where you say you apply this program to determine what the contexts are. And even methods in the narrow sense may not be that important. But I think what I call that's methodology. Methodology is the way to reflect how we create a research field, how we approach it before we use the methods, how discourses frame the way we think things are of interest and how we should proceed with them. So we should look at them, if you like them, the other word, as discourses. And here it is curiosity, again, through comparisons that are questioning our taken for granted assumptions to make them visible as assumptions. And, why do, for instance, the English, why did they love and probably still do sports? And the Germans hated sport. They said, that's terrible, that's a disease. We want to have gymnastics, Turnen, that's completely else to say. Why do have some school systems school uniforms, others don't? Why can adults with a baccalaureate or matura, or whatever you call it in England, enter in any university in Switzerland and not in the US? I have a high school diploma from Noblesville, Indiana. I cannot go to Stanford with that. Say, I have a high school diploma. Say, well, get out of here. I can go to the IHR in Zurich, one of the best universities. Why is it so different? The access, the transition rules. Why now here again, why did England pass a school law so late, like in 1870, and others were 250 years before that? That is a good idea. So curiosity is a way to can be fueled by comparisons in order to make us aware from which we usually start our research. And that's the interesting point. That is why our research objects are always a case of something. Schools, systems, but even our way to think about and do research are usually products of doing nation, of having become national. I use this doing nation, by the way, from doing gender. Kind of how do we do it that people start to feel the way they are, not only as women or men or something in between, but as nationals? What are the everyday strategies by which people become and act in a particular way and not in another? That makes us, all of us, strange to others. What are they doing? So, and these strategies are different. And in different contexts, they appear different. Now, you were once, sorry about that, a world empire, and Theresa May asked Boris Johnson, where is global England? It's not there anymore. We are nothing anymore. Now that's something completely different as, for instance, Switzerland or Austria that has in the 18th century a European power, but in a way doesn't play an important role in the world anymore. So how do they shape these trajectories of history, of culture and nationalities, shape people as kinds of people and shape research? So that's my last slide. The interesting point of research is not what we see, but what makes us see things. It's about invisibility. It's about the invisible frames that are so powerful that we usually don't examine them anymore. We start from them. Now, if we come to nationalism and its analogies, I think this is one of the hinges, the important hinges, with which we can question our epistemologies that seem so sound to us, but that are not so sound somewhere else. Research becomes exciting on a global scale only if we can talk about a thing as a particular case of something that is kind of framed in a larger frame. Our cases of interest in research are always cases of, and that's where it starts to become interesting for readers, not being socialized in the same context they do, like we have. So, last point, if you would like to see how we did that for nationalism, or started to do that, I would like to refer to you to two publications that I was co-editing. One is the New World Yearbook of Education. It's going to be published in about a month or two, about globalism and nationalism, or something else. You can see it on the reference list in the back. If you read it, fine. Send me a mail if you're interested. Enter a discussion, and I'm done. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much indeed, Daniel. That's wonderful. Very fascinating, very challenging and stimulating address to get us all going on a lunchtime. And I really enjoyed that very much indeed. Thank you.